Hi, my name is Michael McSheehan, and I've been working in the area of multi-tiered system of supports, MTSS, for about 15 years around the country, working with a variety of schools and school districts to help them leverage multi-tiered system of supports to improve learner outcomes and to promote a sense of equity and inclusion within their local systems.
Hi, my name is Loui Lord Nelson, and I've been working in the UDL world for about 15 years also. I work all over the world with schools and districts and ministries of education, helping them to embed practices that align with the UDL framework. I have several different publications and host a podcast called UDL in 15 Minutes. And all of this is geared toward helping people understand how to develop opportunities for expert learners and create environments that lead toward equity and inclusion.
Today we'd like to talk with you about a tool that Loui and I have been doing some thinking about for the last year and a half. And we're really quite honored that the Indiana IEP Resource Center got behind this idea and put this idea out there. We each had been doing work with the Resource Center here in Indiana, and in a conversation, it came out that, wow, we're doing some UDL work and we're doing some MTSS work, and it would be really nice if we could think about these two things together. So they tasked us with doing some thinking together to see, can we bring these two frameworks together into one unified approach for schools and districts to apply? And so we started doing our thinking, and we landed on reimagining MTSS through Universal Design for Learning. And what we're going to introduce to you here is a practice profile, or a way of laying out the essential ingredients that we landed on for how we came to braid these two things together. So we'll start off by just kind of reviewing with you some basic information about MTSS and UDL. And then we're going to kind of lay out for you what the tool is, what it looks like, and give you some considerations for how you might use it. So let's start with MTSS. MTSS, from my work individually at the University of New Hampshire with the Swift Education Center, really has aimed to understand and to apply what we know about prevention, proactive efforts in our schools, database decision-making, and really strategic allocation of teaching resources. And that's done at the school and district system arenas. Loui?
Universal Design for Learning is a framework that we use, again, to make instructional decisions and design decisions for lessons and for learning environments. And that's really about helping us understand and apply what we know about the brain and what we know about variability, and that taking that into that design and then the delivery of the learning. Typically, we tend to think about UDL as an application within the classroom, and then also it can be school-wide, it can actually be district-wide and larger, but most of the time we're thinking about the classroom, learning environments, and within the school.
MTSS, as the name would suggest, is a tiered instructional delivery system. So we look to, within a kind of comprehensive or an integrated approach to MTSS, we're aiming to bring together all the various content areas that educators are concerned about for their learners. So all academics, reading, math, science, unified arts, concerns and questions and interests around behavior, and social-emotional learning and its social-emotional well-being. Within that framework, we want to bring together not only the content areas, but also all the systems and services that we bump into in schools, and develop a unified system. So instead of having a general ed and a special ed and a Title I and an ELL service delivery system, MTSS can be leveraged in its framework to bring all of those together into one service delivery system.
When we think about the UDL framework, and it's all based on what we know from neuropsychology, neuroscience, education, special education, and this is about taking evidence-based practices that are organized within that framework and understanding how to use those so that we can help build learner agency, and that's what we talk about when we're thinking about expert learners. And we're doing that through giving them choice-making opportunities, reflection opportunities. But then we also are recognizing that every learner is variable. And that variability has to do with context. So where we are when we are learning and our relationship with that place, with the people within it, with the resources, directly impacts our learning. And that is the crux of universal design for learning.
When implementing MTSS, leaders are really, as I was just saying, trying to set up the broader system. So an interest on the part of MTSS is to have structures for educators to come together across the various silos or roles or labels that we exist in education. So leaders are working to leverage that tiered teaching system, if you will, to be able to talk about the whole child, if you will, and to be able to talk about all learners in a building. Although, quite honestly, in practice, when I look around the country, I see MTSS leverage for definitely more learners, but I don't know that we're yet at the point of all learners actually being actively acknowledged in the system. Still something we're figuring out.
I think similar to MTSS, Universal Design for Learning started off with saying, how can we include all learners within this learning community? That has always been the point. And so we're looking for ways to lower barriers that students might be experiencing within a learning environment, and understanding that the barrier doesn't sit within the learner, that the barrier sits within the context. And we are lowering those barriers so that the learners can reach the goal. And with the UDL framework, what we're doing is designing that environment, designing those lessons so that we are creating a context that is ready for all learners. But just like Michael referenced, not quite there yet in a lot of settings. And so more and more learners, and it's very exciting, but that end goal of all learners, we're still working toward that.
Which really brings us to kind of how we came together within this work, and how the Indiana IEP Resource Center started to point to this interest of braiding the two frameworks together. And so as we started our work, given that we have a history of collaborating on other projects, we started a series of conversations that really focused first and foremost on our common shared interests. And then as we explored our interests, we also came up with a list of tensions that exist within the two and across the two frameworks. So I'll hit a couple of the interests and tensions, you hit a couple of the interests and tensions, and then we'll chat those out for folks. Because this will help you kind of know the context or how this practice profile, how this tool is situated, and how it might apply for your work. So we look across the two frameworks and we see that there's some common beliefs across Universal Design for Learning and multi-tiered system of supports. Right, this interest in hitting all learners, developing and applying a framework for all learners. Addressing, on the MTSS side, we tend to talk about differentiation and the wide array of learners that we have in our classrooms. You all have different language for that on UDL, so I'll let you take that.
We look at that more in the learner variability, so, but it even goes a little bit slightly a different direction. It pulls away from that a little bit more in the sense that acknowledging that we all learn differently, every single one of us, right, because the brain isn't going to have the same connections in the same way, is the easiest way to put it, between two people. And so it's recognizing there's this constant variability, and that's the STEM, from which we work.
Yeah. You all really have some great language that just really describes it quite well. The last kind of belief that for us resonates really highly across the two frameworks is a belief that all learners, each and every learner, can achieve to high standards. And we challenge ourselves to walk that talk. What are the sets of practices? What are the systems that would actually support us as educators to be able to live that for each and every learner in the system? So we identified that as an interest as we started to talk about bringing these two frameworks together. across both frameworks, and I think across our approach to applying the frameworks, we both have a high commitment to let's do our first best instruction. Let's do our first best teaching. And of course, always be redesigning, revising how we're approaching our teaching and learning. But we want to do the best job we can first for the greatest amount of learners that we have in our classroom, in order to get them closest to the desired outcomes that we have, whether those outcomes be social emotional outcomes, academic content area outcomes, or behavior outcomes. Those desired outcomes, I think, also show up across both frameworks. But I'll let you add anything you want there.
Yeah, so the exciting part about this conversation when we started to talk about first best instruction was that that's what the UDL framework is all about, because you're using the framework before you even would know your students, because you're thinking about the variability that it's likely going to be there. And in fact, we know it's going to be there. I always use the example of you're likely going to have students who read below grade level. You're going to have students who read above grade level. In most places, you're going to have students who don't speak the main language that's spoken in that area. So just from the get-go, you are using the framework, which is full of all these evidence-based practices, to start thinking through and designing what you're going to be providing to your learners, and to give them, another term that we use in the UDL community is the flexibility. And so you're deciding and using methods, strategies, tools, resources in different ways, but then you're providing this buffet to your students, and then they can come in and they're learning how to choose what works best for them. So it gets to that first best instruction because we're starting from that platform in the beginning. Yeah.
And yet what you just landed on sets up some of the tensions. Yeah. So most often when I see folks implementing multi-tiered system of supports, I'll see a very adult-driven system where adults are coming up with the recommendations for matching a learner to an intervention or an intensified instructional approach or an intensified support across their day. And that adult-directed nature, still teacher-directed instead of learner-directed, is one of the tensions that we bumped into in the conversation. Another one that kind of steps from that a little bit is this: while we have the common interest in prevention and being proactive in teaching, we realized the methods for getting there were slightly different in the two frameworks, at least in how we've seen them be applied. Whether or not they were intended this way, the way it's kind of played out in the field. For MTSS, when people talk about prevention, there's an immediate conversation about your universal screeners. So what are the universal screening measurement tools that you're using across your academic and arenas and your behavioral arenas? And we know that universal screeners, for the most part, the ones that are rated as very technically sound, don't necessarily address all learners. So you're kind of right from the get-go set up with doing this prevention action that still doesn't include all learners, even though that's what you're trying to get to. So there's some tension there around, does prevention mean using a screener, or is it some other kind of event or process that involves use of some screeners?
Yeah, the other part of the conversation that we had is that when you're using screeners, that these are tools that are set up with a level of fidelity that you aren't going to shift how it's delivered and what the content is. And then we know that that automatically establishes a barrier for some of our learners. And so all of a sudden we're not assessing, we're not finding out the information that we need. And so then we might turn to something else, but then that can very quickly alter the conversation and go down a pathway of removal or separation. And so these were really interesting conversations to start having and saying, well, how would we go after this? and what are some of the things. So it's a little precursor to what's discussed within the tool, but we have just a few more things to go through here within our interests and our attention before we move there.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of under the umbrella of how we think about assessment. We bumped up against some tensions across the two frameworks. Quite often in MTSS conversations, I'll hear schools and districts and other MTSS leaders quite often deferring to assessments that are linked to our state or national standards and are attending to measurements of knowledge and skill and determining tiers of support or intensified supports based on where you're at with those standards, those academic, behavioral, or social emotional standards. So we're always returning to a place of what does the learner know and is able to do as a focal point for thinking about the learner, their knowledge and their skill sets. Whereas in UDL...
Yeah, we're thinking about the expert learner. We're always designing toward opportunities so that our learners are having, again, opportunities to identify purpose in their learning and understanding and finding that internal motivation, knowing that we have to play that game of external, internal, back and forth and back and forth. We are helping them gain knowledge, which is a very traditional thing. That's what school's always been built on. But the rest of these haven't been. So the other is resourcefulness. And so helping our learners understand how to look through their environment and identify what resources are going to work best for them in that moment for that goal. And then also being strategic and goal directed. So obviously understanding how to look at this bigger picture and saying, oh, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to do. And these are the steps that I'm going to take to get there. And so this goes back to that learner agency conversation that when we are giving our learners the opportunity to make those choices, those decisions, make some mistakes, have time for reflection, then they're going to be able to move toward that expert learner stance versus the adult-driven environment where it's always handed to the learner, they do, they produce, they give back. They aren't working towards those skills.
Right. At least not explicitly
Right.
in the way that it's described in the MTSS framework.
Right.
That doesn't mean that individual educators aren't out there doing that, but we want to put that more explicitly into the frameworks that we're promoting. Finally, there's this notion for us, the kind of tension and aha for us in this, for me in this work, coming in as the MTSS guy within this conversation. As we had our conversations and started to describe a unified framework, and we looked through the elements that we landed on, I had a rather powerful and uncomfortable aha moment where I no longer saw the tiers that we would typically reference, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We're no longer in the final product that we landed on. So just a teaser, if you want to quickly flip to the product right now, it's not in there. You're not going to see tiers anymore. You're going to see a solid foundation of high quality instruction and then strategies for intensifying supports. Now, a year ago, that might have been seen as a very radical idea. But we're actually just coming off of being at a rather large national MTSS conference where, in fact, one of the keynoters was talking about this exact shift in our field, that we're ready now to move away from talking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, to truly set a foundation of really great instruction and curricular experiences for learners, and then intensify our supports as needed.
So here it is. We're going to introduce to you now the practice profile. So what you have on your screen and what you can see, and just to briefly go through the organization of the tool. Across the top in each of the sections, we would have a category name. So what you see in front of you is beliefs and principles for developing expert learners. And in the left-hand column, we talk about the essential component. And these were components that Michael and I came up with. There are 13 of them. And this was after, again, months of conversation and back and forth. But if you think about it, these are the overarching concepts. These are the big, big things under which then we have what are called the implementation status pieces. So we started thinking about and went back and forth with, well, what would we need to see? Because that's what you're doing with a practice profile. You're identifying what you can see, what you can observe, what you yourself can see and observe, because we're doing a lot of self-reflection with a practice profile that relates back to the essential components. And so that left column, the essential component, and then from there, moving to the right, you have full implementation that lists out all of the different things that Michael and I agreed you'd want to be able to see with that essential component. And then with developing, we were just determining where you might be within that continuum. And then, of course, there's beginning. And it's fine to be at beginning, because if you're working with the tool and you're at beginning, then that means you're also becoming aware of where you want to go.
So if you look at the tool that we've produced, you'll see color-coded big banners on pages. Those are the categories. So in this example, you see beliefs and principles for developing expert learners. That's a category. Then you'll see the numbered essential components. And then the next column will be the look for, the descriptor aspects of those. We hope that that organizational structure is really helpful to you in understanding kind of the big ideas that we had. So you've got these big ideas in categories with then some kind of benchmarks for the individual components. We really encourage you to not think about this rubric, if you will, this practice profile, as something that is final and done. This is a thought piece from us. We actually are starting to work with districts now who are beginning to implement it. And part of implementing any practice in your local system means adapting it for your local context. So we encourage you to read through this information and just start having conversations internally, exploring the different components that are described in the tool, and having conversations with colleagues to say, does that resonate with us? Is that how we think about teaching and learning in our local system? Reflecting maybe on your own practices. What are the shared interests you have in your teaching practices with what you see in this tool? And where are there tensions? What are those tensions like for you? And does that open up a conversation for change for you? And then finally, you might use this as a guide for implementation. So if you locally tweak, adapt, personalize the language to your context, we've set up the tool in a way that gives you kind of a scoring and progress monitoring aspect to the tool. So you can go through at an individual school level, right? This tool is introduced for school leadership teams to sit and talk about and reflect on their local practices. And once you agree on the elements in the tool, you can set up a way to say, okay, so here are our strengths, things that we're fully implementing or partially implementing, and here are places where we're just beginning. What's the best next step for our school? So there's not a, start at component number 1, and then once you get that to full implementation, then move to number 2. It's not set up that way. It's very much a dialogue piece for you that could also supplement a systematic scored monitoring process for your school improvement efforts.
I think the other important thing to think about with the practice profile and reflecting on what Michael just said is that you do want to know about your context, right, and know your area, and that's going to influence your development and use of the practice profile. But I do want to say that we both brought our backgrounds in MTSS and UDL respectively, and then also because we have had many years of working with one another on a project that brought these two things together. So we had some lovely time before that to even think about these things. So if you were to enter a tool like this and didn't feel like you had a level of knowledge in either one area or the other, then we would encourage you to turn to resources which we're going to address for you. And there are plenty of others, but sticking with good quality, strong resources from both of those areas to ensure that when you're developing or working with your own practice profile, that you're still staying within the defined areas and recognized components and essential components of MTSS and UDL.
Yeah, so let me just say that one more different way, see if I'm also hearing it. The tool is built with an assumption that people have a background in MTSS and UDL. So we've not developed the tool as a entry point for people who don't understand one or the other framework. You'll have to do some of that background work in order for some of the language and some of the concepts to make sense.
Right.
So if you don't have local expertise within your local system for MTSS and UDL, you'll probably want to introduce that somehow, bringing in that expertise. The tool is developed with an assumption that who's ever facilitating its use in your local system is bringing expertise in both frameworks to the conversation.
So finally, we can offer you some resources that you can look to gain some of this information. Michael has listed for MTSS, looking at the Swift Education Center, their information, and there's a video for you to watch, and that's actually where we're working together and we're able to build a lot of this competency and knowledge with one another. And then also Michael produced with IEP Resource Center's support, a video about the essential elements of MTSS. And then with UDL, there's a great video that was created by understood.org. And it is a teacher who he provides his reflections on why he chose to use this framework, how he uses this framework. It follows him around in the classroom. You're seeing students working within that room, but there's constant underscoring conversation with the teacher about it. And I find that it's really useful for a lot of people to watch, especially when they're new to UDL and they just want to get something in their head. And then I also had the privilege of working with the Indiana IEP Resource Center to produce a video about the essential elements of UDL, so that's available to you also.
We wish you well in exploring the tool, and we encourage you to reach out and get in touch with the Indiana IEP Resource Center. If you have questions about the content in the tool, you're also welcome to reach out to each of us individually. Our contact information is available within the tool itself, within the document, and within these slides. So thank you for viewing this, and good luck with exploring reimagining MTSS through UDL.
Thank you.